So you will see the show.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Book for Lunch. Sorry to interrupt your speaking, but I don't get started, then I don't hear Darryl enough time to speak. So I don't have to do that today. So as you know, Darryl will speak about Parsons, the magnet, for Book for Lunch. And then Laura Jones will come tomorrow, and she'll be speaking on the book that she wrote, Song of a Wounded Heart. She's from Oklahoma, and some of our staff that reads this book. And then on Thursday, Sharon Breyer from CCC College, or the librarian, is going to be speaking on the ancient Japanese. So come and have lunch with us all 3 days. Today's meeting, tomorrow is taco bar, and if you don't want to have meat because it's limbs, we can make your own taco. You know, not as exciting, but okay. And then Wednesday is potato bar. Again, you can make your own. So
Wednesday or Thursday.
Thursday is taco. Potato bar. Okay. Just a couple of announcements. We are thrilled to have our new door.
Yes.
And our new entrance, our new ADA entrance, so the other doors will be locked. If you really want to, you can go out those doors, but, yeah, depends on where but you can't come in with those. That one. Okay, just that one, that's our main door. And, yeah. And we're having our book for lunch upstairs today because our elevator is broken and we need to buy a new panel for it, and we're in the middle of getting a new panel. And so for that, to get a panel to us to get it fixed is a little bit of money, but also it's difficult to find the panel. So we couldn't get it fixed in time, and we didn't want to cancel another thing. So we did. We're delaying murder mystery until October. I think we're gonna do it October 11th unless something comes up. But that's what the friends have a schedule for right now. So, because of the elevator, just to be checking with them, we can't downstairs. So that's why we're doing what we're doing. So if you're ready, Darryl, I'll let you take it away.
Melanie, you were supposed to go. Here's Darryl. I guess you all got that reference because for 30 years, Ed McMahon introduced Johnny Carson on the Tonight Show with "Here's Johnny," and that probably became, if not one of the most recognizable and repeated slogans in the history of television. There was even a business in Michigan that delivered those porta potties to special events and things. Their business was called "Here's Johnny." Once the NBC attorneys found out about that, they made him change his name. Change the name of his business. But the way that came about, Ed McMahon, before he became associated with Johnny Carson, worked at a local TV station in Philadelphia. And they had a correspondent on their team who had one of those names where the first name and the last name both start with the same letter. So he would always introduce him. He'd say things like, "Now let's go to our correspondent, Roger Ringwald." Kind of drag that out. So he wanted to do the same thing with Johnny Carson, but he didn't think that, to hold the Johnny was good, and he didn't think that Carson was good. So he came up with "Here's Johnny." And like I said, he did it for 30 years, so it seemed to be working. The Tonight Show started with Jack Parr and dominated the late night airwaves, and then he decided to retire in 1962, and Johnny Carson took it over and emceed the show, hosted the show for 30 years, from 1962 to 1992, and absolutely dominated the late night ratings. Now, for most of his career, there were only three networks. There was ABC, CBS, and NBC, which carried the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. But he had competition, you know, there was the Merv Griffin Show and the Dick Cavett Show, and later on, Pat Sajak, and he dominated all of them when it came to the ratings. The show was so profitable and so popular that NBC would give Johnny Carson basically anything he wanted. One year they built him a tennis court at his house, a covered tennis court at his home in Malibu, just to keep him happy. The show generated 20% of NBC's profits. And if you think about it, if there were other hit television shows like Gunsmoke or Bonanza or Friends or Cheers, those shows were only on once a week. But the Tonight Show was on every night of the week. So people wanted to advertise on it, and the money, the revenue just came, you know, rolling in. And it didn't cost much to produce the Tonight Show. All you needed was a desk, a microphone, and a couch for the guests to sit. It wasn't like Gunsmoke or Bonanza where you had stage coaches and horses and scenery changes and things. So anyway, the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson was just an absolute cash machine. And Johnny knew it, and then he could get, you know, anything that he asked for. To give you an idea of the money involved when you have a hit TV show, just the theme song, you know, da 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 da. Well, when Johnny was getting ready to take over the show in 1962, he knew he needed a theme song, so he went to Paul Anka, you know, famous singer-songwriter, and he said, "Would you write me a theme song?" And Paul said, "Yeah, I will." It's one he already had written, you know, years ago, just kind of had it in his inventory. He said, "Yeah, I'll give you a theme song. I'll tell you what, if you pick my theme song, I'll give you half the rights to the song. I'll give you half the royalties. You can be half owner." And over the 30 years of the Tonight Show, on average, just the theme song made Paul Anka and Johnny Carson both between $300,000 and $400,000 a year. So no wonder, you know, when Johnny Carson died, he had a reported net worth of $450 million. 160 million of it went to charity. So he had a good heart, mostly charities that supported young children. But he was an absolute kingmaker. You know, he was one of the wealthiest men in television. He was one of the most powerful men in television. Comedians would come on the show and they would do anything to get a spot on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. And several of them that were interviewed in the book, Jay Leno and Jerry Seinfeld and David Brenner and on and on. They said, if you got a spot on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, the next day your phone would ring off the hook. People calling you, offering jobs. You want to host this, you want to do that. So he was an absolute kingmaker. If he liked you, if a stand-up comedian came on and did their performance, if he liked you, he'd give you the okay sign and a wink, and might say something like, good stuff, good stuff. And if he really, really liked you, if you really hit a home run and knocked it out of the park, he would say, "Yeah, come over here, have a seat." And he would let you sit on the couch for a little while. So that's what every comedian, everybody that wrote a book or sang a song, that's what they dreamed about. So what made him so great? What made him so popular and so good at his job? Basically, I think it boils down to just he was so darn likable. He was funny, handsome, but not too handsome. And he didn't try to act smarter than he was. And he was just somebody that people liked and welcomed into their home. There's several quotes in the book about how good he was at the job, and several people said that Johnny Carson was the most quick-witted, fastest thinking, naturally funny people they'd ever been around. I'll give you a quick example of his natural funniness. The fellow that wrote most of the book was a guy by the name of Bill Zaney. He was talking to Johnny, interviewing him at a park. They were just sitting there on a park bench, and a pigeon just, kind of walked up to their bench, and Johnny Carson then leaned forward and said, "Any messages?" And just naturally funny. Some other memorable quotes from the book. The first one that comes to mind is his producer, who produced the show from 1962 to 1972, said Johnny Carson was great by omission. And the first time I read that, I thought, boy, I wish I was smart enough to come up with clever, deep sayings like that. And then my second thought was, I wonder what that means. So as you delve into the book a little bit more, I think what he was saying was Johnny Carson was great by omission, in that he knew exactly what he was good at, and he did it. And he didn't try to do anything more. Ed McMahon said it a different way. He said, Johnny packs a tight suitcase. And years later, Johnny Carson said, Ed, you had that quote, Johnny packs a tight suitcase. What's that mean? And Ed McMahon said, but Johnny, you bring exactly what you need to the job and nothing more. And kind of on that same line, Johnny had a quote. He said, if you have a comedian on the show, don't try to compete with him. Let him be funny. And the show will be better because of it. Don't try to steal the spotlight. Be comfortable letting your guests be the star. And I think a lot of talk show hosts didn't get that. I remember as a kid, I would go home after school and watch the Mike Douglas show. Remember that? It was on every afternoon at 4 o'clock. And Mike Douglas could not let the guests be the star of the show. I'll give you an example. If he had a famous chef on the show, and the chef is showing us all how to create some nice meal, Mike Douglas he couldn't help himself. He just had to jump in front of the camera and make some joke or something. And Johnny Carson never did stuff like that. And I think that was one of the things that added to his popularity. People just liked him. Ed McMahon had another great quote. He said, Johnny Carson is great in front of 10 million people. In front of 10 people, not so much. He was notoriously shy, hated things like cocktail parties and things like that. He was just very, very uncomfortable in that kind of a setting. But you put him in front of a camera behind his desk, he was comfortable. And again, everybody says, nobody's better. Jay Leno, David Letterman, all of them said, Johnny was the standard that we all compared ourselves to. Nobody's ever going to touch him. Now, I did have a few clips that I wanted to show you of the master in action, but unfortunately, the agony and the ecstasy of technical difficulty, something about our spark plugs on our computer, the points weren't opening wide enough, something else. But we couldn't make the two work, so. But there's a million clips on YouTube. Sarah was telling me about one earlier before the meal. So if you ever want to, just get a good laugh, just go to YouTube and Google Johnny Carson clips. There's a lot of funny ones. So anyway, here he was. He dominated the late night airwaves. He became one of the most powerful men in the history of television. How'd he get there? Well, he grew up in Norfolk, Nebraska. Now it's spelled Norfolk, but I think the people that live there pronounce it Norfolk. You'd think it'd be Norfolk, but they pronounce it Norfolk. So he grew up in Norfolk, Nebraska. He did not come from money. His mother was a homemaker. His dad was worked for the power company, worked for the local utility company. And he had an older sister and a younger brother, and he was always a funny kid. he became obsessed with magic tricks when he was just a young boy. And his family members say he would just drive him crazy, walking around the house with a deck of cards, pick a card, any card. And later on at family reunions, if they wanted to rib him a little bit, they'd go, pick a card, any card. Because that's what he said all the time. So he really got into magic. His mom sewed him a little cape, and she made him a little tabletop, a little covering tablecloth for his little magic table, and he called himself the Great Carson. And he did magic when he was in grade school and junior high and high school. His first gig was with the Norfolk Rotary Club. They gave him $2 or $3 to come to one of their programs and do magic tricks. And he would, do magic tricks at birthday parties and things like that. It was really a good job for a young kid. He made way more money doing that than he would have, delivering newspapers and working at the local grocery store. He was shy. People misunderstood his shyness. In his high school yearbook, they always have those sections where you can write comments to people. And there were some comments in there like, you're stuck up, you're conceited, but Johnny said they just didn't understand the shyness. Now, there was a couple of memorable quotes that people wrote in his yearbook, and I want to share them with you. One in particular was pretty fortuitous. Miss Jenny Walker, a prim, no-nonsense math teacher, wrote in his book, John, you have the ability to make people laugh. You have a fine sense of humor, and I think you will go far in the entertainment world. He had that matted and framed, and he kept it in his office all the time. And I understand, I haven't been there yet, but I understand at the Johnny Carson Museum in Norfolk, Nebraska, they've got a lot of his memorabilia, a lot of his awards and things, and that matted and framed quote is there. One of the other kids wrote, "Dear John, you're one of the finest comedians to hit this school. If you aren't killed in this war, you'll really make good." I say, well, boy, how's that for a sound on? But it was during World War II. He graduated from high school in, I think, 1942. Enlisted in the Navy, qualified for officers training school. And by the time that 2-year program was over, the war was pretty well over. But he did have one duty that couldn't have been very pleasant. He was one of the officers on a ship that got hit by a torpedo, almost a tornado. But got hit by a torpedo, and they had to seal off that area of the ship that was hit by the torpedo, and there were over 20 sailors that were killed that were in that area, and they couldn't do anything with it until they got back to port, which took 18 days. So when they got back into port after 18 days, it was Johnny, young officer Carson's duty to oversee the removal of the bodies and all of the personal effects of those sailors that had been killed. So, like I said, that had to be a very unpleasant, gruesome duty. But the war soon ended after he became active, went back to college at the University of Nebraska, met his first wife. Anybody want to guess how many times Johnny Carson was married? 2. You're close. 4. He was married 4 times. His first 3 wives all had a name that began with J. First wife was Jody, second wife was Joanne, third wife was Joanne. And Bob Newhart used to joke it was Johnny kept marrying women whose names started with J because he was too tight to buy new bathtubs. J and J. His 4th wife was Alexa, and they called her Alex, so he did finally veer away from the J's. Anyway, when he was in college, met his first wife. They had 3 children, all boys, and Johnny, always a performer. performer, had gotten interested in broadcasting. Radio was still pretty new in 1949 when he got out of college, and television was really, really new. But he went to work for WOW Radio in Omaha. I used to listen to WOW when I was a kid, 590 on the AM dial, and they're still there. And then he eventually switched over to television. WOW TV did a little news program and things like that. But he decided where the action was California. So he took his young family and moved to California and got a job at one of the local TV stations there. He had a 5-minute program called Carson's Coffee. It ran at 10 o'clock in the morning. And I say 5 minutes, but by the time you throw in, 3 commercials, you really only had to come up with about 3 or 3.5 minutes worth of content each day. But he would tell some jokes about the news of the day and entertain people for 5 minutes. And one of the people that liked to watch the show was Red Skelton. Remember Red Skelton? Red Skelton had his own television show, a variety show. Red Skelton was a comedian, a lot of slapstick physical comedy. And there's really quite a story to this, but I'll shorten it. Red Skelton called Johnny Carson up and said, "Would you like me to come on your show sometime?" And of course, Johnny Carson said, "Yeah." So he did. Red Skelton made a few appearances on the show, and they hit it off. And Red Skelton hired Johnny to be one of the writers on the Red Skelton Show. And like I said, Red Skelton's show had a lot of physical comedy, and they were filming a scene where Red Skelton was supposed to walk through a door, but he was supposed to be one of those breakaway doors, only the door didn't break away. And Red Skelton got a concussion. Couldn't host the show for a while. So they said, "Who do you want to, host the show in your absence?" And he said, "Johnny Carson." He was Johnny by this time. He grew up being John his whole life in Norfolk. But yeah, so he gave the skinny kid from Norfolk, Nebraska, a chance. Johnny hosted the show, did well. I mean, after all, he was Johnny Carson. He was funny and he was likable. And that led to a job offer from CBS on the East Coast. First, he hosted a little show called Choose Your Vacation. It wasn't on the air very long. And then they came up with a new show that he hosted for 5 years called Who Do You Trust? And big break for him. So he hosted that show out of New York City for 5 years, from 1957 to 1962. And then he got the call from NBC saying, "Hey, Jack Parr is going to retire. Would you like to be his replacement?" And he didn't want to do it at first. He thought, "I've got a pretty good deal going here hosting Who Do You Trust? I'd come to work at 11 o'clock and we take the show and, I hang around for a couple hours and go home at 3 or 4 and I make pretty good money." But eventually he gave in and he agreed to host the show. It was filmed in New York in those days. For the first 10 years or so of the show, it was filmed in New York, and then they later moved it to Burbank, California. But so anyway, I guess the rest is history. He hosted the show for 30 years, and he was a big hit, and everybody liked him. And you'll hear a lot of funny stories because it's a book about a comedian. You'll find a lot of interesting facts because Johnny Carson was an interesting fellow. The last part of the book concentrates on Johnny Carson, the man. And I might mention, it's almost like 2 different books because it was written by 2 different people. You can see it says Bill Zamey with Mike Thomas. Well, you might wonder, why did it take 2 people to write that book? Bill Zamey was an Esquire, worked for Esquire, wrote a big feature on Johnny Carson one time. It was really well received, and everybody said, "You ought to write a book on Johnny Carson." So he thought, yeah, that's a good idea. So for the next 10 years, he said he was working on this book about Johnny Carson. And he was very thorough. If Johnny Carson had a third cousin who lived in Machu Picchu, Bill Zamey would find a way to interview him. But before he could finish the book, he developed colon cancer and died. So his friend who's also, a journalist, Mike Thomas, thought, what a shame. All that work, all that material, if this book never gets finished, it is an absolute crying shame. So he got permission to get all of Bill Zamey's interviews and all of his records, and he actually finished the book. Bill Zamey had a real flowery writing style with lots of obscure words. When I was reading it, I needed to either have a dictionary by me or my wife, the English major. I was like, Donna, what is a picadillo? I mean, it's just lots of obscure words. But anyway, a good book. The final part of the book, or I would say the third part, is just Johnny Carson, the man. If you know anything at all about Johnny Carson, for years people said, oh, nobody really knows Johnny Carson. Nobody gets close to Johnny Carson. He's cool and he's aloof and he's this and he's that. And yeah, apparently that is true. He had a drinking problem, especially in his younger days. He was a mean drunk. He was unfaithful to his wives. He was aloof and distant. He could be kind of mean. There's some great quotes from his wife, Joanna, his third wife. She said they would go out to eat at a nice restaurant in Malibu, and Johnny would have a few drinks while he was at the restaurant, and you could just see the change in him. She felt like she would go to the restaurant with one man and come home with a different man. And in an interview on 60 Minutes with Mike Wallace, Johnny Carson admitted that. He said, I did not drink well. He said, some people, when they drink, they want to be everybody's friend and they just love everybody. And some people are the opposite. And that was me. I was the opposite, and it happened like that. So yeah, it wasn't nice to be around when he was drinking. Joanna also said, as brilliant as Johnny was when it came to comedy, that's how bad he was at relationships with women. Now, some people blame his mother. They said she was kind of aloof and distant too. A couple examples from the book. Johnny got some big award and called up his mom. He was all excited. He said, Mom, they gave me this award, and they only hand it out to people that they feel like are making a real positive difference in the world. And his mom just said, well, I suppose they know what they're doing. They flew his mom and dad to the taping of one of his shows, and they sat in the front row of the studio audience. And afterwards, an interviewer went up to Mrs. Carson and said, well, how did you think your son did tonight? She said, I didn't think he was very funny. So, and this is the sad part. Reportedly, when Johnny Carson got the news that his mother died, he said, well, the Wicked Witch of the West is gone. Yeah. He didn't attend either his father or his mother's funeral. Now, he said that, it was because where I go, the media goes. And he didn't want to turn it into a big circus. So I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. When he retired in 1992 at the age of 67, he really retired. Carl Reiner said Johnny Carson might be the only guy in the history of show business that really meant it when he said he was going to retire. Because a lot of people, comedians, actors, singers, they just love the applause, the warmth that they get from an audience, and it's really difficult for them to give it up. But not so with Johnny Carson. In the first 2 years of his retirement, he made a few appearances here and there, but very few. Everybody thought there would be the Johnny Carson Christmas special, and Johnny Carson hosts the Emmys, and Johnny Carson goes home for Thanksgiving, that kind of thing. But a few little appearances in the first 2 years, and then after that, nothing. When he was done, he was done. He didn't go to his office anymore. He didn't do anything. And people would say, well, Johnny, don't you miss him? And his typical 3-word answer was, I did it. I don't need to do it again. He was probably kind of smart because he said that when people watch you night after night, you gradually age in front of them. And it's easier for them to accept. But if you're out of the public eye for a few years and you come back and all they can think about is, oh, he's fatter than he used to be. Oh, his hair's grayer. Oh, he has less hair. Oh, his voice is thin. So he didn't want that. He didn't want to compete with himself. He felt like, I've got a 30-year body of work here, and I'll let my work be, stand on its own. So he had no desire to come back and, have another television show or anything like that. He would have had plenty of opportunities. But once he quit for good. Went to spent a lot of time on his yacht. He loved the water, enlisted in the Navy, had a nice boat, read hundreds and hundreds of books. He had a tremendous curiosity. He would read about, geography, history, foreign language, even taught himself to speak Swahili. So he was a very curious guy, loved to golf, loved to play tennis, spend time on the boat, read, and didn't feel the need to be in the public eye. So, as I said earlier, it's an interesting book because he was an interesting guy. Funny book because he was a funny guy. He tells the story about coming to New York City for the first time. He said, I went down to Times Square. I sat my bags down. I looked around and I said, all right, New York, I'm here to conquer you. I looked back down and my bags were gone. But he did it. He conquered the television world. And the book, like I said, it's interesting. It's good. Sure, you hear about the bad side of Johnny Carson. But in my opinion, thankfully, the biggest impression that I got from the book was, wow, was he ever good at what he did? And boy, did he make us laugh. Any questions?
Did he get along with the band director?
Yeah, I think so. Doc Severinsen was his band leader for most of the time. And I think they got along. Doc Severinsen said Johnny was a good boss. He was a fair boss. If something needed to be dealt with, he would deal with it. He wasn't afraid to deal with it. But yeah, I think he liked Johnny Carson. Ed McMahon, worked with him for 35 years. So I think he liked Johnny and there was just when he started out, he was just a young kid holding the cue cards for Johnny when he was hosting Who Do You Trust? And Johnny brought him with him to the Tonight Show, and he worked for Johnny Carson for 35 years. So, yeah, I think he liked it. Well, most people, I think, liked Johnny Carson. They just didn't feel like they could get to know him very well. And he was generous. He was very generous with his money, unless you asked him for money. He didn't like that too much. He'd be happy to give it away, but he didn't like it when people came and asked him for it. Yeah.
Oh, man.
Did anybody ever dwell or delve into his childhood? Obviously, this is
Well, that's what they think. Amateur psychologists are, everywhere, I suppose. But there's a lot of books about Johnny Carson. This is the only one that I've read. So I guess I don't really know the answer to that question.
Well, we're just interested in the fact that what he did on a boat, people that are deceased, that's got to be a little problem too.
Yeah.
But I just wonder what his background was at home.
Oh, I think from everything I've read, had a happy home life. They claimed that his mother was not a loving person, but he had he was close to his brother and his sister. In fact, his younger brother, Dick Carson, was one of the producers on the Carson Show for years and years and years. So I think he had a good relationship with his brother and sister. Yeah.
Did he stay married with his last one?
What's that?
His last wife, did they stay married?
Yes. Yeah, and she was like 24 years younger than him. Real pretty lady, as you can imagine, and now, I think she's spent, he died in 2005, so for 20 years, she's had a pretty good time spending Johnny's money. From what I can tell. Yeah,
I was gonna ask when he passed, but you said 2005.
yeah, January of 2005.
And how many kids total do you have?
3 kids, yeah, all of his first wife. One son got killed in a car wreck in, late in Johnny's career, like around 1990 or so. And he wasn't real close with his kids, apparently. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, he probably didn't, well, yeah, he was off, being a big star, and probably didn't spend a lot of time with them, is my guess.
Darryl, I really enjoyed how in his monologue, he would take some semi-obscure or well-known fact of the day and then put a twist on it. And at Logan County, they got some marijuana and kept it for the trial. And then they disposed of it by burning it in the fireplace, and he explained this. And they then discovered that there was a big bird nest and all the smoke came out into the. So it was really fun to hear that night.
Did Johnny Carson talk about that?
Yes, he did. And so I think he made more out of the after effects of that than actually happened, but who knows?
Oh, yeah, he was so great. And of course, he had writers, but he was so great in topical humor. Anything that was going on during the day, he could find a way to make jokes about it.
And Karnak the Magnificent was a lot of fun. I got to brag on myself. He always had a triple thing at the end. So Ed McMahon says, King Tut, Dean Martin, and Billy Carter. And I knew the answer before Johnny said, name a mummy, a rummy, and a dummy.
Yeah, it was funny. There was one, the answer, Inca Dinka Do. And then he would open the envelope, oh, the question is, what to look for when tracking an Inca Dinka? Just goofy fun stuff like that. But I think that's another reason Johnny Carson was so popular. He was kind of a clown, and he wasn't afraid to dress up like Floyd R. Turbo or Karnak the Great or Ed Fern, the movie reviewer. And he would take a pie in the face, and he wasn't too good to make a fool of himself. But anyway, gosh, thanks you so much for your attention.
Thank you.
A lot of times people will, I know a lot of people that have written a book and reviewed the book. I don't think anybody is surprised to learn that I can't write a book, but a few of you were surprised to learn that I could read one. Anyway, thanks so much for your attention.